Hey everybody, today's video is going to be on the immediate aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, focusing on the time period roughly between 1945 and 1950. Here are your video goals. First, let's start by looking at the world order as it was intended to work after World War II. One of the most important things that happens at the end of World War II is the formation of the United Nations. This is a little bit like the foundation of the League of Nations after World War I, except the United Nations is a lot more powerful and more effective. Basically, the United Nations is an international organization designed to resolve disputes between countries, and also to allow countries to work together on international problems. Now, the United Nations is a lot more powerful than the League of Nations because all of the major powers of the world, including the United States, joins the United Nations. And the United Nations has this thing called the UN Security Council that is very important. Basically, the UN Security Council is made up of countries that have special powers within the United Nations. And most importantly, they have the ability to veto any UN activity. So any sort of resolution or law that the UN wanted to pass could be vetoed by any one of these countries. So all 5 of these countries have to agree on anything before the United Nations can do anything. Now that's going to be important because, as you're going to see, the United States and Russia are not going to agree on very much for the next 30 or 40 years. So anyway, the members on the UN Security Council and the people who are basically in charge of the UN are the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. And you'll notice that these 5 countries are the countries that were on the winning side of World War II. The other major development in the aftermath of World War II was the emergence of 2 superpowers. Some people call this a bipolar world, a world with 2 equally matched or almost equally matched, very powerful countries. And so the old world powers in Europe, like Germany and England, are essentially broken by World War II. Germany is literally broken apart into 2 separate countries, and England, which had been a world power for the last couple hundred years, is now basically too poor and too small to compete with the new superpowers. And the 2 new superpowers, as you probably already know, are the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States is a superpower primarily because it is the richest country in the world. The United States produces more stuff and has more wealth than any other country at this time period. It also has the most advanced technology in the world, especially in the form of atomic weapons. And for this reason, because it has money and technology, the United States is very, very powerful. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, has the largest army in the world, at least the largest land army. And they also have direct control of much of Europe and Asia. And if they wanted to, they could pretty easily invade and take control of even larger parts of Europe or Asia. And so because they're both very powerful, they are considered to be the 2 superpowers. And this is problematic because they distrust each other. For various reasons that we're going to look into, the United States and Russia both fear the other one, and this leads to conflict. There are a number of pretty good reasons for distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. One reason is that the 2 countries have conflicting philosophies. The United States believes in capitalism and democracy. Essentially that private property and private money should sort of decide who owns what and what gets made. And democracy being that normal people should get to decide who runs the government. And that the government should essentially be controlled by normal people. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, has the sort of opposite philosophies of communism and dictatorship. So communism believes that rather than allowing people to private money and private ownership to determine what gets made, is that there should not be any private property, and essentially that either the government or nobody should control all of the wealth and all of the stuff in the country. Essentially that people should not own anything, that it should all be controlled by the government. And a dictatorship says that basically the normal people should not have any control over the government, but rather that the government should have control over the people of that country. So these are totally opposite philosophies, and we'll look more at these in class to try and understand sort of the differences between these two. But basically right now you can just understand that they stand for totally different things, sort of opposite worldviews. The next reason that they mistrust each other is because they had conflicting goals. Both countries want to spread their philosophies around the world. And because they believe in opposite philosophies, what this means is that they're in competition with each other in trying to spread their ideas. So if communism spreads to one part of the world, that means capitalism will not spread to that part of the world. And related to this is the fact that each country is trying to expand its global influence. They're trying to build up a network of alliances and control around the world. And you can see on that map there, basically the different parts of the world that either the United States or the Soviet Union end up controlling. The light blue areas are the areas that are brought into an alliance with the United States, and the red areas are the parts of the world that are brought into an alliance with the Soviet Union. So we see both the superpowers trying to spread their power and their ideas around the world. And because they're both trying to do this, this leads to conflict. And last of all, there were a number of secret betrayals during World War II that led to mistrust between the two countries. It kind of showed that they were never really on the same team. Even though they were both fighting Nazi Germany, they both distrusted each other. For the United States part, the United States kept some of its biggest military projects secret. Most importantly, the United States tried to keep the atomic bomb secret and never told the Soviet Union that they were working on it. For the Soviet Union's part, the Soviet Union was spying on the United States the entire time. And what this means is that the Soviet Union knew about the United States' secret atomic bombs, even though the United States was keeping it secret. So the Soviet Union knew that the United States was lying to it all throughout World War II. And so that is a pretty clear reason not to trust somebody if you know that they're keeping major secrets from you, even when you're on the same team. So those are the reasons that they mistrust each other. And this mistrust is going to lead to conflict immediately after World War II. So because the United States doesn't trust the Soviet Union, it adopts a strategy called containment. And basically what this means is that the United States is going to try and keep the Soviet Union from spreading its ideas and from spreading its control around the world. And containment is containment takes two forms, rather. There's a sort of economic containment that is called the Marshall Plan, and military containment that comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine, after U.S. President Truman, who is president during this time period. So the Marshall Plan is basically where the United States gives money to foreign countries in order to help them not become communist. That is, by giving countries money and helping them to develop and rebuild after World War II, it'll be less likely for a communist revolution to occur. Because if the people are happy, then they'll be less likely to support communism. Military containment is where the United States uses its military support to help non-communist nations fight off communist takeovers. And so what this means is that the United States ends up supporting a lot of governments around the world, many of which are dictators. Essentially, as long as you are not a communist, the United States is willing to back you up and give you support. And so This is how the United States seeks to contain the Soviet Union, partially through giving money, and then partially by giving military support to countries around the world in order to prevent the spread of communism. Now, the place where conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union begins is in Europe right after World War II. And so, as you already know, neither of the two sides trusted each other. However, the United States and the Soviet Union have to work together in occupying and rebuilding Europe. But both sides have different ideas about what Europe should look like. The United States wants Europe to be, for obvious reasons, like the wants them to be like the United States. And so the United States, in accordance with the ideas of containment, tries to prop up capitalist democracies in Western Europe. On the other hand, the Soviet Union wants to spread communism and wants to spread its philosophies and its style of government. So in the areas that it controls, it sets up Soviet-style communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. And so you can see that essentially the blue parts, which are the parts of Europe that the United States controlled after World War II, you get democracies and capitalist systems. And in the red parts, you get Soviet-style dictatorships. Now, this is all fine, but the place where conflict really starts to develop is in Germany. You'll notice that Germany is actually divided into two segments. There's a blue segment that is part of Western Europe and is set up as a US-style capitalist democracy, and a red side that is set up as a communist dictatorship. And so it is in deciding how Germany is going to be governed that the first serious conflict between the US and the Soviet Union develops. And we're going to look more closely at that right now. So immediately after the war, when Germany surrendered, it was occupied by four powers: the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Now, the original plan, as everybody had agreed, was that Germany would be reunified as a single country. But this would only work if the country had a single philosophy and style of government. You can't have one country with two governmental styles. And this is a problem, right? Because the United States wants Germany to be a capitalist democracy, while the USSR wants it to be a Soviet-style communist nation. So anyway, what this means is that they can't reunite the country. So what happens is that in 1948, Britain, France, and the USA get tired of waiting, and they just go ahead and unify their three parts of Germany into a capitalist style, or a capitalist democracy. This makes the Soviet Union angry because they don't want Germany to be a capitalist democracy, which, by the way, is what Germany was before it attacked the Soviet Union in the 1930s. So the Soviet Union is scared of another capitalist Germany. And so what they do is they try to block the United States from making this move. And they do this by blockading off the city of Berlin. And there are sections of Berlin controlled by the United States, and what this means is that when the Soviet Union blockades Berlin, there are lots of people in the there are lots of U.S. citizens and people, German people, in the western part of Berlin who are cut off from all food supplies, which means that they're at risk of starving to death in Berlin. And so what Stalin was trying to do is he was trying to hold the city of Berlin hostage in order to prevent the United States from unifying Western Germany into a capitalist democracy. But the United States doesn't back down, and instead what they do is they set up something called the Berlin Airlift, where they use old World War II planes to supply Berlin with food until Russia finally gives up on the blockade in 1949. And so now that the Soviet Union has failed to prevent the unification of Western Germany as a democracy, the Soviet Union instead decides that it's going to make its part of Germany its own country. And they form East Germany in 1949 and set it up as a Soviet-style dictatorship. And this is the beginning of sort of direct confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Here's a picture of the Berlin Airlift. You can see kids gathered around watching the US plane come in. And so that plane is actually carrying food that's going to keep the people in the city of Berlin alive. So anyway, with the split of Germany and the kind of beginning of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, both sides realize that they're going to have to settle in for a sort of long, simmering conflict. The United Nations is actually useless in trying to resolve this conflict because both the United States and Russia have seats on the Security Council, which means that each side can block the UN whenever they disagree with anything. So the UN is pretty helpless in preventing this conflict. Also, in 1949, Russia tests its first atomic bomb. You can see the picture there. And so now what this means is that both the United States and Russia have nuclear weapons, and that if one side attacks the other side, both sides will end up getting nuked. And what this means is that any sort of direct conflict between the two countries will lead to massive devastation for everybody. And so what this means is that there's really no easy way out of the conflict. If it goes to war, then both sides will be destroyed. But what this means is that instead of fighting each other, they have to sort of compete with each other over a long period of time for global control and everything like that. All right, so that's what you got for today. Make sure you know these terms. We'll have a quiz on this eventually. See you guys.